This is Up Close. I'm Stephen I. Weiss. In this week's episode, we'll look at three very different ideas of feminine roles in morality, religion, and politics. You might not know a lot about nuns, but one woman who's hardly a Catholic Church apologist thinks some nuns are especially worthy of praise. Yahoo Travel managing editor Joe Piazza is the author of If Nuns Ruled the World, 10 Sisters on a Mission. And then, is the situation for women in Israel actually going backwards? Many would argue that's so, and Alana Marilis Stockman puts forth her arguments in The War on Women in Israel, a story of religious radicalism and the women fighting for freedom. But there has been rhetoric about a war on women here in the U.S. too, targeting the Republican Party. One political commentator would like to turn that around and accuse liberals and the Democratic Party of causing harm to women. Fox News contributor and townhall.com news editor Katie Pavlich is author of Assault and Flattery, The Truth About the Left and Their War on Women. But first, here's my interview with Joe Piazza, wondering about what might happen if nuns did rule the world. You're embracing the idea of celebrating nuns and celebrating a certain part of Catholicism. That's very, I'd say, very distinct to your generation, to
Absolutely.
Your values, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And I celebrate these progressive, brave, very fierce nuns in this book. And they're nuns that have gotten in trouble with the Vatican. I mean, we talk about that right off the bat because they're nuns that are out there every day fighting for things the Vatican doesn't necessarily believe in. But I think it's a story that needed to be told for a lot of reasons. One, because these women are so humble. They're never going to tell the stories themselves. They don't go out seeking press. In fact, I had to convince most of them to be in the book with me. And two, because I think it's important for young Catholic women to hear these stories, to hear stories of brave women in leadership roles in the church, despite the fact that the Vatican won't let them have actual leadership roles.
Many people's expectations of nuns is that they're relatively cloistered, relatively calm and
Exactly.
and not
boring, kind of boring.
Yeah.
This book seeks to shatter those stereotypes in a lot of different ways. So we have nuns. The profiles are very narrative. And so we talk about the things that they do. These are women fighting for social justice. They're fighting for gay rights. One of them fights for abortion rights, which is, hugely controversial in the church. But then I also talk about the human side of them, how they dated before they became nuns, how they came to the decision, how they meditate, how they do yoga, how they go jogging. And I really, it's cheesy to pull an Us Weekly line, right? But it's like nuns, they're just like us.
But one of the fascinating things you delve into is the idea of how nuns came about, in part through an effort to say certain women can have more control over their reproductive lives, right?
Absolutely. I mean, we're looking at nuns coming about in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries. I mean, that's really when the livelihood started evolving. And becoming a nun, in a way, gave them a sense of freedom because it released them from the patriarchy. It released them from a life where they were going to be pregnant, essentially, for about the 15 years that they had of adulthood because you're constantly giving birth because so many of the babies didn't make it back then. And it let them live their lives. And so we're looking at the ancient society of nuns that were given that kind of freedom. Then we're also looking at a lot of the nuns in my book who were women that joined in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, where they didn't have a whole lot of options to go to college to get master's degrees, to get PhDs, and to live a life where they didn't have to get married and be subjugated to their husband.
And now, is there a war on women in Israel? Here's my interview with Alana Marilis Stockman. Women's rights in Israel are in some ways getting quite a lot worse.
Yes, that's true. We've seen a lot of things getting worse because there's no real restraints on political power given to religious parties, and there are no mechanisms in place to limit the powers that religious parties and religious leaders have. So, and then you have secular leaders who are afraid for their coalitions and afraid for their perceptions of Haredi voters, whether or not it's true or not that this is what Haredim want. And what you have is a system that's really out of control on the issue of separation of religion and state.
Right, so this Haredi or ultra-Orthodox group, which comprises Hasidim, which comprises right-wing, black hat Orthodox types, they have long had a culture war with a lot of the rest of the Jewish world. But in Israel, there's a lot of government allowance given to them to further push that culture in a way that you don't get here in the States.
Right, exactly. My argument in the book is that the gender segregation that we're seeing and the religious extremism that finds expression on women's bodies around gender segregation and modesty squads and agunot and conversion and women of the wall, all of those things, all of those places where religious fundamentalism and religious extremism are targeting women's bodies, all of those are not necessarily what the Haredi population wants, but it's being espoused by certain leaders in the Haredi community, and it's being supported and enabled by secular businesses and secular governments that don't want to rock the boat or don't want to anger what they perceive as, Haredi interests.
But we do have, in terms of their voting patterns and in terms of the elected leadership that they continue to elect, first in primaries, just for their parties, and then in electing specific parties in the ultra-Orthodox world, they're electing people who are certainly promoting this rightward shift, right?
Yes and no. What we're really seeing is that there's a real tension. I think that there's a cultural tension within the Haredi community to begin with, and within all Orthodoxy. It's not just the Haredi world. It's also, I think, the religious Zionist world and the modern Orthodox world, that there's a tension between these two forces. There's one force which is saying, we have to be more religious, more strict, more, and more strict, of course, means more strict vis-a-vis women. And there's another cultural pull which says, where are we headed with this? This is ridiculous. Where are we going? Where does this come from? This is not what we want. And that's what we're witnessing.
And finally, arguing that the left is the source of a war on women in the United States, Katie Pavlich. Your book starts from a premise that I think most people can agree with, which is that we live in a highly patriarchal society, and there are lots of people who are saying and doing nasty things about and to women. And it happens to be the case that a good number of those people, especially men, are on the left.
Right, exactly. To give you a little bit of background on where this idea for this book came from, as anyone who's paid attention to the 2012 presidential election knows, that the war on women meme was used very successfully by the left. And I was sitting at the 2012 DNC convention in Charlotte, North Carolina, for days listening to all these speeches about the war on women. And all of a sudden, they played this 5-minute, 7-minute tribute video to Ted Kennedy and stamped the words "women's rights champion" right across the screen. And to me, the war on women argument was already, I thought misleading and false. But then to glorify someone like Ted Kennedy at a convention that was claiming to be standing up for women's rights and women's equality, I thought that was a little bit over the line, that someone had to step up and at least offer a counter argument.
It seems more likely that what your argument here is that Obamacare is simply a bad policy, rather than whether it's actually an intent to address women specifically that is detrimental to women, as opposed to, say, for example, on issues of choice and abortion, where that is very specifically, it's pretty universally regarded as a women's issues policy.
But on the abortion and choice issue, the left talks about that issue and talks to women in one way and treats them in a very different way. They talk about women needing to have all the information and the choices, but when you actually dive into the way that people, like at Planned Parenthood, for example, who do get a lot of government funding, $500 million a year, actually approach that issue, they go out of their way to limit information that people want women to have about what abortion is and about what their options are. And so there are different perspectives on that issue in terms of, we can debate whether you're for abortion, pro-choice, or pro-life. But there are some very basic things that, giving information to women, giving them all of the information about what is going to happen, that's something that we should all agree on in terms of giving women all of the education.
But on the overall sense of, in any given policy, you're talking about disclosures around abortion, and the idea that would constitute that what you say is a failure of the left to address, to provide those disclosures. Well, at the same time, if one is going to talk about the overall effect of a given policy towards abortion for women, certainly access is is a very large part of it.
I
relative to
do not
disclosure.
believe that. I mean, this is not really necessarily in the argument, but I do not believe expanding access to abortion procedures is necessarily good for women or good for the population as a whole, and it's certainly not good for the babies that are never born as a result of expanding access to women. So, that's just my personal opinion, but it doesn't dive into this idea, which is a basic concept of no matter what procedure you're having, whether it's abortion or knee surgery, or you're going to go on some antidepressant medication, you should be given all the information about a medical procedure that apply to those, and it should apply to abortion as well.
That's all for this week's abbreviated web episode of Up Close. A reminder, you can see the full episode of Up Close on the Jewish channel on cable, or listen to the full audio of the show as a podcast, available on iTunes or your favorite podcast player. The Jewish channel is available on cable, Time Warner Cable Channel 1640, IOPLING Channel 505, RCN Channel 268, Cox Cable Channel 1, Bright House Channel 330, Verizon Fios Channel 900, and on Comcast on the on-demand menu on premium channels. For more information, visit tjctv.com.